In a world where age often brings skepticism, Clara Mitchell, a retired lawyer, proves that true brilliance knows no bounds. When she steps into a courtroom to represent a client against a major corporation, the odds seem stacked against her. Mocked by the judge and prosecutor for her age and appearance, Clara's resolve only strengthens. Armed with decades of legal experience and an unyielding spirit, Clara takes on the system, showing everyone that intellect and determination are the ultimate tools for breaking through prejudice. Watch as Clara defies expectations and redefines what it means to be a force to be reckoned with. Clara Mitchell had always been a woman who believed in quiet strength. At 72, her once sharp eyes still retained a steely determination that had served her well throughout her illustrious career as a top defense attorney. After years of retirement, Clara had decided to return to the courtroom, this time not as a defense lawyer for high-profile criminals, but as a representative of the underdog. Her client, a small local property owner, was locked in a legal battle against a major corporation that sought to seize his land for a lucrative development project. Clara knew the odds were stacked against her. The corporate giant she was up against had vast resources, and the case was complex, involving intricate zoning laws, historical property rights, and a tangle of legal precedents. But Clara was undeterred. She had spent decades in the courtroom, navigating the murky waters of legal battles, and she knew exactly how to stand her ground. The morning of the hearing arrived. Clara dressed in a crisp beige suit, her silver hair neatly pulled back into a bun. Her hands, though veined and wrinkled with age, moved with purpose as she prepared her case. With each carefully organized file she placed on the desk, she felt a surge of anticipation. She had spent the last few weeks reviewing case law, consulting with experts, and strategizing her argument. She was ready. As Clara wheeled herself into the courthouse, the room grew noticeably quiet. People in the hallway whispered, casting sideways glances at the elderly woman in the wheelchair. To them, she was just another retired, frail individual, certainly not someone who could go toe-to-toe with the young, powerful players she would face inside the courtroom. As she entered the courtroom, all eyes turned to her. The young lawyers, some of them with smirks plastered on their faces, exchanged glances as if to say, "What is she doing here?" Even the bailiff raised an eyebrow but said nothing. Clara, however, paid them no mind. She knew what they were thinking, but she also knew that thoughts and opinions were nothing more than distractions. She was here to do one thing: win. Judge Samuel Harris, an aging man with a reputation for being both sharp-witted and condescending, looked down from his bench and smirked. He had seen many lawyers in his time, but none as old as Clara. "Well," he muttered to the prosecutor, Benjamin Carter, "this is going to be an interesting show." He leaned back in his chair and gave Clara an appraising look, his eyebrows arched in disbelief. Prosecutor Benjamin Carter, a young man in his late 30s, adjusted his tie and chuckled under his breath. He was confident, cocky even, and had no doubt that Clara would not stand a chance against his corporation-backed legal team. He had made his reputation by winning case after case, never losing to anyone, let alone a retiree. "Ma'am," Judge Harris began with a condescending tone, "are you sure you're in the right courtroom? This is a court of law, not a knitting club. Perhaps you wandered in here looking for your grandchildren." He let out a chuckle, and a few of the younger lawyers joined in, too. The room echoed with laughter, and for a moment, Clara felt the sting of their mockery. But she did not flinch. She didn't even blink. Her gaze was steady and calm, unwavering as she remained seated in her wheelchair. She knew that this was not the time to rise to their bait. Instead, she sat silently, preparing her notes, her hands working efficiently despite the disparaging remarks. She had heard it all before: the mockery, the disbelief, the skepticism. As a young lawyer, she had fought similar battles. She had been underestimated and dismissed on many occasions. But each time, she had triumphed. And now, even in her retirement, she was ready to do it again. Judge Harris' smirk deepened as he continued to taunt her, clearly assuming she wouldn't have the capacity to handle a case of this magnitude. "I trust you're well acquainted with courtroom etiquette, ma'am," he sneered. "Let's hope your memory serves you better than your physical appearance." Clara sat still, allowing his words to pass over her like water. She knew better than to engage in this kind of verbal sparring. There was no point in proving anything to him yet. She was here to present the facts, to make a case that no one could ignore. That was all that mattered. As she rolled forward to the center of the courtroom, ready to present her opening statement, the prosecutor leaned forward in his chair, shaking his head. "This should be a spectacle," he whispered to the judge. "She's going to be eaten alive." Clara didn't acknowledge the insult. She simply adjusted her glasses, opened her folder, and began. Her voice was steady and clear, and she spoke with authority, despite the atmosphere of mockery that hung thick in the room. "Your Honor," Clara began, "this case is not about me, my age, or my ability to stand before you today. It is about justice for my client, who has been unfairly targeted by a corporation that has taken advantage of the law to strip away his property rights. I ask that you hear me out before making any assumptions about my capacity to handle this case." For a moment, there was a stunned silence. The mockery that had previously filled the room was replaced by an odd quiet. Clara's voice was soft but commanding, filled with experience and a quiet wisdom that demanded attention. Judge Harris, noticing the sudden shift in the room, straightened in his chair. His smile faded, replaced by an air of uncertainty. Perhaps there was more to this elderly woman than he had initially thought, but he quickly recovered, clearing his throat and preparing to dismiss her once again. "Proceed," he said coldly, though he couldn't shake the nagging feeling that maybe, just maybe, he had underestimated Clara Mitchell. As Clara moved forward with her case, she knew that she had already won the first battle. She had earned their attention, and now it was time to prove that her age had nothing to do with her skill. She would show them that wisdom and experience could not be measured by years, only by results. Clara Mitchell's hands moved with practiced precision as she opened the folder containing her meticulously prepared arguments. She took a deep breath, settling herself into the chair behind the defense table, feeling the weight of the entire case on her shoulders. Her client, a small property owner, had trusted her to defend his rights against the corporate behemoth trying to seize his land. As she stood up to begin her presentation, Clara's calm demeanor contrasted sharply with the buzz of skepticism that rippled through the courtroom. Judge Samuel Harris leaned back in his chair, his fingers tapping absently on the gavel, still amused by the elderly woman standing before him. He was ready to dismiss her, to assume that her advanced age would prevent her from understanding the complex nature of the case. But Clara was determined to make them listen. She began her opening statement, her voice clear and steady, without hesitation. "Your Honor, esteemed members of the court, I stand here today not as a relic of the past, but as a defender of justice," Clara began, her eyes sweeping over the gallery. "The corporation in this case has acted deceitfully, bypassing legal procedures and taking advantage of the law to unlawfully seize my client's property. My client has been deprived of his rights, and I intend to prove that the law is on our side." She paused, allowing her words to settle in the room. The courtroom was still, almost too still. The mockery that had filled the air earlier seemed to have subsided, at least momentarily, as Clara laid out the foundation of her argument. She began referencing zoning laws, presenting evidence that clearly showed the defendant corporation had misrepresented its claims and ignored crucial property rights. But before she could continue, she was interrupted by Judge Harris. He leaned forward, his sharp eyes fixed on her with a mixture of amusement and disbelief. "Miss Mitchell," he said, his voice dripping with sarcasm, "you've made some claims, but can you actually back them up? Do you truly understand the intricacies of zoning law, or are you simply reading from some outdated book on the matter? You do realize this is a highly complex case, right?" The courtroom shifted uncomfortably, but Clara remained unshaken. The judge's challenge was nothing new to her. She had faced many men who underestimated her, who tried to dismiss her based on nothing more than her gender and age. But Clara knew better than to let their words affect her. She had spent years navigating the legal system, dealing with people who were far more arrogant and dismissive than Judge Harris could ever be. "I am fully aware of the complexities of the case, Your Honor," Clara replied, her tone measured but firm. "In fact, I believe my years of experience have given me a unique perspective on these matters. You see, when it comes to justice, it's not about who's the youngest or who speaks the loudest. It's about who has the facts on their side." Clara continued with her argument, presenting key pieces of evidence that exposed the corporation's efforts to manipulate zoning regulations in their favor. She outlined in detail how they had falsely claimed to have proper permits, and how they had intentionally misled public officials in order to expedite the land-grabbing process. As she spoke, her confidence grew, and the eyes of the room began to shift. The once dismissive expressions of the young lawyers in the gallery were replaced by a cautious curiosity. However, Benjamin Carter, the prosecutor for the corporation, wasn't about to let Clara's calm composure slide without further resistance. He stood up, his chair scraping loudly against the floor, and took a step toward her. His voice was laced with mockery, his earlier confidence returning with a vengeance. "Your Honor, with all due respect, I believe we're wasting the court's time. I'd like to remind Miss Mitchell that this is a serious case," Benjamin said, his tone dripping with condescension. "Perhaps she should leave the lawyering to the experts and let the professionals handle this." His words were met with some snickers from the gallery, but Clara wasn't fazed. She had heard far worse in her time. She let the prosecutor's insult wash over her, her eyes never leaving him as she stood her ground. "Mr. Carter," Clara said, her voice cutting through the tension like a knife, "if you believe I am wasting the court's time, I suggest you take a closer look at the evidence I've presented. I have no intention of leaving this to professionals like you who hide behind corporate interests and manipulate the system for your own gain." The courtroom fell silent, and for the first time Benjamin seemed caught off guard. His jaw tightened, and he took a moment to gather himself before responding. Clara's calm, unwavering response had struck a chord. The gallery, once filled with quiet laughter and skepticism, was now on edge. The judge, though still skeptical, had stopped smirking. He glanced briefly at his fellow judges and then at the opposing counsel, no longer as certain of his own position as before. Clara pressed on, shifting the conversation back to the case at hand. She deftly dismantled the prosecutor's arguments, pointing out the flaws in his reasoning and providing concrete proof to support her claims. As she laid out her evidence, the crowd's initial dismissal of her began to fade. Even the younger lawyers, who had once found her presence amusing, now watched in rapt attention. At one point, Clara paused, her eyes narrowing as she looked directly at Judge Harris, her gaze unyielding. "Your Honor, let me be clear," Clara said, her voice calm but resolute. "This case is about far more than just land. It's about the very principles upon which our legal system is built: fairness, transparency, and accountability. If we allow corporations like this to manipulate the law, we are setting a dangerous precedent for the future. She spoke with such conviction that even the judge seemed to pause. For the first time, he seemed to consider the weight of her words. His face, once filled with mockery, was now tinged with uncertainty. The prosecutor, Benjamin, still tried to undermine Clara's credibility, but his words lacked the same force they had earlier. The courtroom's energy had shifted. Clara had commanded the attention she so rightfully deserved, and with each word, she seemed to gain more ground. The credibility that she had initially lacked in the eyes of the court was now firmly established. As Clara concluded her opening statements, she felt a quiet sense of satisfaction. She had not only met the challenge but had also turned it on its head. The judge's smirk was gone. The prosecutor's confidence was shaken. And for the first time, the courtroom was listening. Clara Mitchell had made it clear she was not to be underestimated, and this case, this fight for justice, was far from over. Clara Mitchell stood at the defense table, poised and focused as she continued her presentation. The courtroom, once filled with skepticism and dismissive laughter, had grown noticeably quieter. Judge Harris and Benjamin Carter, the prosecutor, had stopped exchanging glances and sarcastic comments. Their demeanor had shifted slightly, an unease hanging in the air that had not been present earlier. Clara knew she had them on the ropes. She began to carefully dissect the opposition's case, pointing out the inconsistencies in the corporation's arguments. She moved seamlessly from one piece of evidence to the next, calling attention to the contradictory statements the corporation had made, as well as their failure to follow proper legal procedures. Clara's voice was steady, but her words carried a sharp precision that demanded attention. "Your Honor," Clara began, "the defendant corporation has relied on misleading statements and false claims throughout their arguments. They assert that they have the right to seize my client's property based on a zoning error that they themselves fabricated. Let us not forget, the original zoning laws and regulations were violated by the very company now attempting to evade responsibility. Their entire case hinges on a falsehood." As Clara spoke, the courtroom's energy shifted. The once dismissive young lawyers in the gallery were now watching intently, their faces furrowed in concentration. Even the stenographer, who had been quietly typing away without much emotion, looked up and paid closer attention to Clara's words. Clara's argument was solid, airtight, and it was beginning to show. Her confidence had become contagious, drawing even the most skeptical members of the room into her narrative. Judge Harris, who had initially leaned back in his chair, now found himself straightening up. He had started to realize that Clara was not just a senior woman making empty claims. She had substantial knowledge, and she knew how to wield it. His earlier mocking expression faded into one of reluctant respect as he briefly consulted his notes. He looked at Clara, then back at the defense table, his brow furrowing in thought. For the first time, he seemed to be reconsidering his earlier assumptions. Benjamin Carter, too, seemed taken aback. Clara's arguments were systematically tearing down the foundation of his case. The once confident prosecutor now appeared tense, his jaw tightening as he reviewed his notes. He leaned toward his team, whispering hurriedly, trying to devise a counterattack, but Clara wasn't finished yet. She could feel the turning tide in the room and seized the opportunity to press on. "Let us also remember," Clara continued, "the legal precedents that have been set in cases similar to this one. In Smith v. Greenfield, the court ruled that corporations cannot freely ignore zoning laws simply because they are powerful or influential. The same applies here. The corporation's actions are not only unethical but also unlawful. They cannot be allowed to use their financial resources to manipulate the legal system for personal gain. Clara's reference to a landmark case struck a chord in the room. The younger lawyers, once mocking her age and presumed lack of knowledge, exchanged glances. They had heard of Smith v. Greenfield, and Clara had just cited it accurately, something they had not expected. The judge's earlier doubts about her legal acumen were starting to fade. Even Benjamin, who had been prepared to call her arguments irrelevant, seemed momentarily lost for words. Clara wasn't about to let the moment slip by. She leaned forward, her eyes scanning the room with a piercing intensity. And I'll say this clearly for the record: if we allow corporate interests to override the legal protections designed to preserve individual rights, we undermine the very system of justice we claim to uphold. We cannot allow wealth and power to dictate the law. Her words hung in the air, filling the room with a sense of gravity that had not been present before. The jury members, who had been quietly observing the proceedings, now seemed more engaged, nodding subtly as Clara's words resonated with them. Clara could feel the shift. The courtroom, once a space where she had been laughed at and dismissed, had become a space where her knowledge, her experience, and her ability to fight for justice were commanding respect. Judge Harris cleared his throat, seemingly struggling to maintain his authority. "Miss Mitchell, you make compelling points," he said, his tone softer than before. "But can you elaborate further on the legal precedents you're referring to? It's important that we understand how this case applies to the broader legal landscape." Clara nodded, not in triumph, but with the quiet confidence that came from knowing she had already won the battle for respect. "Certainly, Your Honor. In Smith v. Greenfield, the court made it clear that property rights are not to be easily dismissed, especially when there is evidence of deceitful intent. The defendant corporation in this case has not only violated my client's rights, but has actively sought to manipulate the legal system to its advantage. The court should not let them off the hook based on a fabricated claim of error." Clara's words struck a chord with the jury, and the tension in the room grew palpable. Even Benjamin's earlier swagger had dissolved, replaced by a clear unease. He had underestimated Clara from the start, and now the weight of her legal knowledge and ability to sway the room was undeniable. Benjamin stood up, his earlier confidence crumbling as he addressed the judge. "Your Honor, he hesitated, his voice losing some of its edge. He clearly hadn't anticipated Clara's sharp legal mind, nor had he expected the room to react the way it was now. The young lawyers in the gallery, who had once scoffed at Clara's appearance and age, were now visibly impressed by her ability to control the courtroom and dismantle the case before them. Judge Harris gave him a curt nod, signaling that it was his turn to respond. But Benjamin didn't seem to have an immediate counter, his earlier cockiness evaporating in front of him. He fumbled through his notes, trying to find something to say, but Clara's arguments had already thrown him off balance. "Mr. Carter," Judge Harris said, his voice becoming firmer, "you've heard the defense's argument. If you have something to address, I suggest you do so now, or we will proceed." The shift in power dynamics was evident. Clara had taken control of the courtroom, and the once dismissive judge and prosecutor were now on the back foot. It was a moment of triumph for Clara, not in an overt, boastful way, but in the quiet, resolute confidence that had guided her through decades of legal battles. As the tension in the room mounted, Clara paused for a moment, allowing the silence to fill the space. She wasn't rushing this. She knew the moment had arrived. The courtroom was no longer a hostile environment for her. It was where she belonged. "Your Honor, ladies and gentlemen of the jury," Clara continued, her voice calm but resolute, "the law is not a game. It is a shield for the innocent, a tool to defend the rights of the powerless against the powerful. And today, we have the chance to uphold that law and ensure justice for my client. I trust that, after reviewing the evidence, you will make the right decision." Clara sat back down, her eyes locking with the jury as the room fell into an almost reverent silence. The courtroom had become a battleground where the outcome was no longer in doubt. Clara Mitchell had taken control, and with her mastery of the law, she had proven to everyone present that age was no obstacle to justice. The battle for her client's rights was far from over, but Clara had certainly won the respect she deserved. The once mocked elderly lawyer had now become the formidable force in the room. Clara Mitchell stood at the defense table, her hands steady on the papers before her. The courtroom had been silent, tense with the gravity of her arguments. The once skeptical crowd, including the judge and prosecutor, was now hanging on her every word. Clara had already proven her legal prowess with her keen insights, but she wasn't finished yet. Now, she would reveal the full scope of her experience and, in doing so, shatter any remaining misconceptions about her age or ability. Clara took a slow breath, scanning the room before speaking. Her voice was calm, but it carried the weight of years of experience, echoing off the courtroom walls. "Your Honor, members of the jury, I'd like to take a moment to clarify something that has clearly been misunderstood about me. While I may not look like the typical attorney that walks into this courtroom, I assure you, my age does not define my capabilities. I am not here by accident." She paused for a moment, allowing the words to sink in. Judge Harris and Benjamin Carter exchanged quick, uneasy glances, unsure of what Clara was about to reveal. Clara noticed the subtle shift in their expressions but did not allow it to distract her. She was in control, and now it was time to reveal her full hand. "I have spent over 4 decades in this profession, representing clients from all walks of life. I've been involved in landmark cases, many of which have shaped the legal landscape in this country. In fact, I've taken on some of the largest corporations in this nation and come out victorious." The murmurs in the courtroom began almost immediately. Clara's words were not just a humble brag. They were a challenge, an assertion of power that demanded recognition. The room, which had once been filled with mockery and disbelief, now held a quiet respect. Even the stenographer, who had been typing furiously up until this point, seemed to pause, her hands hovering over the keyboard as if she too was waiting to see what would come next. Clara continued, her tone unwavering. "I've faced off against powerful entities like Blackwood Enterprises, a tech conglomerate that tried to destroy a small startup by manipulating stock prices. I single-handedly exposed their corruption, and that victory has since been cited in multiple legal texts as an example of how the law must protect the underdog. And then there was Merrick & Co., one of the largest construction companies in the country. They thought they could get away with poisoning a local water supply to cut costs. I stood in this very courtroom and took them down. They thought their wealth and influence could shield them, but the law proved stronger." There was an audible gasp from the gallery. Clara's reputation was slowly taking form in the minds of those who had doubted her. The young lawyers who had once scoffed at her now looked at each other, whispers traveling quickly through the room. They had heard of these cases, but to hear Clara herself recount her role in them was a powerful moment. Clara wasn't just a retiree trying to relive her glory days. She was a seasoned attorney who had spent her career dismantling giants. Benjamin Carter, who had been sitting back in his chair with arms crossed, now shifted uncomfortably. His eyes flickered between Clara and Judge Harris. The prosecutor had assumed, like the rest, that he would easily dismiss her, but Clara's unrelenting confidence was starting to turn the tide. He cleared his throat, trying to regain his earlier composure, but the doubts now creeping into his mind were evident. Clara wasn't done yet. She leaned forward, her voice growing more resolute. "And if you need any further proof of my abilities, let me remind you of Westbrook Financial. They thought they could rig the bond market and ruin countless families in the process. I was the one who uncovered their scheme and secured the largest class action settlement this city has ever seen." Judge Harris shifted in his seat, his earlier arrogance slipping away. He had no choice but to acknowledge the magnitude of Clara's accomplishments. The same judge who had once laughed at her, believing she was out of her depth, was now forced to reconsider. Clara wasn't just any attorney. She was a legendary figure in the legal world, and he had grossly underestimated her. "Your Honor," Clara said, addressing Judge Harris directly now, "I have fought for justice my entire life. I have stood in courtrooms where the odds were stacked against me, but I never backed down. And I will not back down now. Not when a powerful corporation is trying to bully my client out of their property. I will not let them distort the truth, and I will not let them misuse the legal system to crush the powerless." Clara's words hit hard. The room was no longer filled with mockery or disbelief. The jury, who had watched with increasing attention as Clara meticulously laid out her case, now saw her in a new light. The lawyer who had been underestimated due to her age and appearance was, in fact, a force to be reckoned with, a legal titan who had spent decades ensuring that justice prevailed, no matter the opposition. Judge Harris, who had spent much of the trial with a patronizing tone, now looked slightly uncomfortable, his posture rigid. He glanced at the prosecutor, Benjamin, who was struggling to hide the unease on his face. The once confident young attorney now seemed to be reconsidering his earlier dismissal of Clara. His thoughts were interrupted when Judge Harris spoke, his voice quieter than before. "Miss Mitchell," he began, "I must admit, I did not fully grasp the depth of your experience. But I do now." Clara smiled, but it was not a triumphant grin. It was simply a smile of quiet acknowledgement. She had known this moment would come, and now that it had arrived, she could feel the shift in the room. Her arguments had been met with skepticism, but they had also been met with undeniable strength. She had laid bare her experience and, in doing so, had demanded the respect she deserved. Benjamin Carter, still visibly rattled, stood up once more, but this time his voice lacked its usual edge. "Your Honor, he began, but Clara interrupted him, her calm and steady voice cutting through the tension. "No need to speak, Mr. Carter," Clara said with a touch of finality. "I believe I have made my case." The entire courtroom fell into a silence so thick it felt almost tangible. Clara Mitchell had done what she set out to do. She had not only exposed the flaws in the opposing case, but had also revealed the depths of her own legal expertise. The judge, the prosecutor, and the jury now knew what she had known all along. She was not just an elderly woman who had stumbled into the courtroom by mistake. She was a lawyer who had spent her life shaping the law, and nothing, not even age, could take that away from her. As the room sat in stunned silence, Clara sat back down at the defense table, her work far from over, but her victory in the courtroom already secured. The battle for her client's rights would continue, but for now, Clara had proven that justice would always prevail, no matter who stood in her way. The courtroom was tense, the air thick with anticipation as Clara Mitchell concluded her final argument. Her calm yet forceful voice echoed through the room, each word meticulously placed, each fact unassailable. She had given everything to this case, her years of experience, her sharp legal mind, and her relentless pursuit of justice. Now, it was up to Judge Samuel Harris to deliver his ruling. Clara sat in her chair, hands folded, her expression composed but not without a hint of quiet satisfaction. She had made her case. The evidence was irrefutable, and the truth had been laid bare. There was no more room for doubt. But would the judge and the jury recognize it? Would they finally see beyond the superficial assumptions they had made about her? Judge Harris, who had once dismissed Clara as an old woman past her prime, now sat at the bench with an unreadable expression. His gaze shifted between Clara and the corporate representatives, who had grown visibly nervous. Clara's arguments had left them with no clear defense, and now the weight of the courtroom's attention was squarely on them. The room was silent as Judge Harris cleared his throat and adjusted his glasses. The tension was palpable. For a moment, Clara could feel the weight of every eye on her, the weight of expectations. The murmurs of disbelief that had filled the courtroom when she first entered had long since died away, replaced by a growing respect. After careful consideration of the evidence presented, Judge Harris began, his voice steady but lacking its previous arrogance. And after hearing from both the prosecution and the defense, this court has reached a conclusion. Clara leaned forward slightly, her eyes locked on the judge. She wasn't nervous. She wasn't even particularly anxious. She had done what she set out to do. She had exposed the truth. But there was something in the way Judge Harris paused that made her wonder if he would finally accept the reality of the situation. The corporation's actions, Judge Harris continued, are found to be unlawful. They have unlawfully seized property and violated the rights of the citizens they were supposed to serve. The defendant is hereby ordered to cease and desist immediately and to compensate the plaintiff for the damages caused. A gasp spread through the courtroom. Clara allowed herself a small, satisfied smile, though she knew better than to express too much emotion in such a moment. This victory was for her client, but it was also for the countless others who had been told that they didn't belong, that they couldn't achieve greatness because of their age, their appearance, or their circumstances. Clara's client, a small family-owned business that had been forced out of its property by the corporation, stood up in shock. They exchanged glances, their faces a mix of disbelief and relief. They had trusted Clara when everyone else doubted her, and now they were the ones who had won. Clara had delivered the justice they had so desperately needed. As the ruling settled in, the courtroom began to stir. People shifted in their seats, and for the first time, the murmurs were not filled with mockery but with admiration. Clara had done the impossible. She had taken on a massive corporation, exposed their wrongdoings, and achieved victory against all odds. Judge Harris glanced at Clara, his expression softening. There was no longer any trace of the smugness or condescension that had defined his earlier behavior. The realization had clearly dawned on him. Clara Mitchell was no ordinary elderly woman. She was a powerhouse, a legal mind that had outmaneuvered him and everyone else in the room. He cleared his throat again before speaking. "Miss Mitchell," he said, his voice somewhat hesitant, "I must apologize for my earlier assumptions. You've proven that the law is about much more than appearances, and I respect your expertise." Benjamin Carter, the prosecutor who had scoffed at Clara's presence in the courtroom from the very beginning, stood stiffly. His face, usually flush with arrogance, was now pale, his confidence shattered. He turned to Clara, unable to hide his begrudging respect. "Miss Mitchell," he began, his voice barely audible, I too owe you an apology. You've shown that intellect and capability cannot be measured by age, and your performance today was nothing short of remarkable." Clara nodded slightly, her smile small but genuine. She wasn't interested in gloating or in rubbing her victory in anyone's face. Her purpose had always been justice, not for herself, but for her client and the truth. The apology, though appreciated, was secondary to the victory she had just secured. As the court began to adjourn, Clara gathered her things with a calm deliberateness, her movements measured and graceful. She could feel the eyes of the courtroom on her, some filled with admiration, others with awe. She had earned their respect, but that was never her goal. Her goal had always been to win the case and to prove that no one, regardless of age or circumstance, should ever be underestimated. When the courtroom doors finally swung open, Clara emerged, her head held high. Her client followed close behind, a look of gratitude and admiration on their face. The journey was not over, but Clara had achieved what she came for. The courtroom, once filled with mockery and doubt, now buzzed with the realization that they had witnessed something extraordinary. As Clara stepped into the hallway, her thoughts were already moving forward. She had won the case, yes, but she also knew that this victory was not just for her client. It was for all those who had ever been told they didn't belong, that they couldn't achieve greatness. She had broken through assumptions, shattered stereotypes, and proved that intellect, experience, and determination could never be defined by age. And as she exited the courthouse, the bright sunlight streaming down onto the steps, Clara knew that this victory was just one chapter in a much larger story, one that she was still writing.